early 50s. So cut to 15 years later, like around 67, 68, Howard Hughes, the richest man, buys the Sands Hotel, and he invests in a couple of other hotels. So Johnny Roselli brokers the deal with Mayhugh. So Johnny actually gets a cut of the sale of the hotels in Las Vegas to Howard Hughes.
Can I go back?
Sure.
You're going on these amazing tangents, and I
Yes.
don't want to cut them off because
Right.
they're great. But I also want to I don't want to skip over some stuff that's pretty wild. There was one thing you mentioned quickly back there that I think is kind of a core root of this story and shows how the business kind of gets done in the CIA, and that's the whole Mayhugh connection. Because you called him a cutout, which is a term they use, but basically he's this insulation blanket, if you will,
Right.
from the CIA to the mafia. But he's this fascinating dude who, as you said, was in the FBI. Then he wasn't, because he becomes the fixer for Howard Hughes, who's the subject of Scorsese's O2 movie. I think it was O2 or 2000, whatever it was, Aviator. Right? Who is this polymath inventor, also like very kind of crazy dude. And he made Mayhugh basically just work for him. But somewhere in there, Mayhugh was able to convince him that, hey, I'm doing some stuff for the CIA too, and that's cool.
Well, bear in mind, a lot of money that Hughes was making, he was in the aerospace, was in the defense industry. So he was a big customer for Uncle Sam at that time. Mayhugh is a fascinating character in and of himself. He's a guy who went to Holy Cross, trained with the Jesuits when they came to him with the plot to kill Castro. He claims that he went home that night and had to wrestle with his conscience. And he was one of those people that said, well, he used the Hitler analogy. If we got Hitler earlier on, we would have avoided so many deaths in World War II. And maybe this is the case here. And I'll do one, I'll take a solid here for my government. I'm being asked by my government to do this. But his relationship with Howard Hughes is absolutely fascinating as well, because early in Mafia Spies, as you mentioned, he's involved. Mayhew's involved with the attempts to kill Castro, but Mayhugh was serving as a detective. He ran his own detective agency or a private eye, whatever. He was involved in setting up dirty tricks with, for instance, a visiting leader of Indonesia, and he set him up with a prostitute, and they somehow recorded that, and that was used as compromising information. So he did a lot of dirty tricks for the CIA. This request to help kill Castro was at the top of the list, though. But he also Mayhugh got to know Johnny Roselli, because one time Howard Hughes wanted to visit Las Vegas on last minute, and when Hughes traveled, he wanted a big suite, and he didn't. Mayhugh, it was Mayhew's job to find the suite for Howard Hughes. And he called a lawyer friend of his, and the lawyer said, what you should do is call Johnny Roselli. Johnny Roselli can move mountains in Las Vegas. He's the guy to call. So that's where Mayhugh becomes friends with Johnny Roselli initially. And then the friendship between the two develops. There is a picnic that Mayhugh has at his back. It's a backyard picnic that he has a number of CIA people in intelligence. He had one particular senator who was there, but also Johnny Roselli had come into Washington at that time period, and Roselli came into Washington. Mayhugh had a house in the suburbs of Washington at that time, and where he had the backyard party, and he invites Johnny Roselli to come there. And that's where some of the CIA agents that would work in this kind of were feeling out Johnny and get a measure of Johnny. And they came to the conclusion that Johnny, as mafioso go, was a solid citizen at least for killing Castro. Later on in Mafia Spies with Mayhugh and Roselli, one of the things that is absolutely extraordinary to me, this is like the late 60s. This is later on in my book, but Roselli convinces Mayhugh, the two of them, to convince Howard Hughes to buy out the mafia in Las Vegas. So Howard Hughes in the late 60s bought out a number of mob-controlled hotels and casinos, including the Sands Hotel. And what's really interesting there, and I recount this in my book, is that when Howard Hughes takes control of the Sands, what he does is he terminates the contract for Frank Sinatra at the Sands. Sinatra always considered the Sands to be his hotel. That's where he would entertain. But there was a problem for him there because Howard Hughes used to go out with an actress by the name of Ava Gardner. In fact, Robert Mayhew once had the assignment to spy on Ava Gardner and Frank Sinatra together and report back to Hughes. This is back in like the early 50s. So cut to 15 years later, like around 67, 68, Howard Hughes, the richest man, buys the Sands Hotel and he invests in a couple of other hotels. So Johnny Roselli brokers the deal with Mayhew. So Johnny actually gets a cut of the sale of the hotels in Las Vegas to Howard Hughes. And Howard Hughes, when he comes in, throws Sinatra out, says, you're out. And Sinatra has to go to Caesars, and that he winds up entertaining at Caesars. But there's actually a fist fight that occurs when during that whole time period when they tell Sinatra that his money's not good there, that he can't as the custom was, gamble at the Sands for free, that they would cover his bets and such. And Sinatra, who was drinking pretty heavily at that time period, was really upset and winds up in a fist fight. And one of Sinatra's teeth gets knocked out, actually, as part of this. So, it's kind of like a sidebar, if you will, in the whole story of Mafia Spies, this whole over. But what happens in Mafia Spies is we have the attempt to kill Castro, and then things go quiet for a while, and it comes back later on. But in that quiet period, it's not so quiet. And this time period when Johnny Roselli with Robert Mayhew, the cutout, but who's also working for Howard Hughes, they brokered the deal so that Howard Hughes buys all these mafia-owned casinos in Las Vegas. And what happens there is that they still keep a lot of the mob-controlled people. So in the hotels in Las Vegas, they call it the skim, the money that, if they collect $10, maybe about $3 or $4, they would not even report that money at all to the government. That was known as the skim. Right. And that money and a lot of the other things that were going on. In other words, the mob kept their people in these hotels. They sold their hotels to Howard Hughes, but they basically had their people running the hotels.
Like the Tony Spilatros and stuff?
Yeah, and there was a lot of money that Howard Hughes that he thought he would be getting. He thought that, oh, wow, I'll get into the casino business. This is a source of great, look at the money that they generate at these papers. Yes, that's true, but the thing is, a lot of that money's going out the door, and it's going back to the same people that sold that hotel to you, and the people that were the two characters that brokered that sale was Johnny Roselli for the mob and Robert Mayhew working on Howard Hughes's behalf, and actually that leads to the bad blood eventually between Robert Mayhew and Howard Hughes, and they wind up in a big lawsuits and back and forth, and he fires Mayhew. Mayhew had a really odd relationship with Howard Hughes too, because Howard Hughes by that point in his life was really an eccentric, a germaphobe who really didn't like to deal with people. And so he dealt with Mayhew over the telephone. Mayhew claimed that he never really met Howard Hughes. Even though he had worked for him for like 15 years, he had moved out from Washington area out to the Southwest, and he moved actually I guess it was in the California area. But he did that all through a relationship that was over the phone. He never he never met Hughes in person. This is a sidebar, but it's part of the story of Mafia Spies. To me, it was amazing that the Mafia sold out its interest in the late 60s, and it was Johnny Roselli and Mayhugh who brokered the deal.
And it's essentially Mayhugh is this super connector in a way. That's what's so fascinating about him, because he's one of those guys that he's lawless but thinks he's protected by the law at the same time.
Yeah.
You know, that's so guys like that, when I look at history, I'm just like, whoa.
There's a scene in my book where when John F. Kennedy is elected, Frank Sinatra oversees the inaugural ball, the big entertainment, and Sinatra calls on all of his friends to entertain at this ball. But there was a plane that left Los Angeles to go to Washington, and the plane, everybody's seat was paid for by Bob Mayhugh, thanks to Howard Hughes. There's a scene in Mafia Spies where when I'm talking about Mayhugh, I recall that scene. They're all very happy. They're going to this big happy celebration of the new president, thanks to Howard Hughes.
God, there's so many characters in all this. So many different people. And like, we know what we know through the things that have actually been released, but I mean, you got to wonder about all the stuff that's never seen the light of day and never will.
Well,
what could be in that?
I really benefited from the fact that a lot of documents and court testimony and hearings, Senate hearings and congressional hearings, those documents, particularly in the last 5 years, there were all these documents that were released that were part of the Kennedy assassination, but they were confidential. So they were top secret and they were not released until around 2017. There were literally thousands of documents. And they helped me a lot in doing this book, Mafia Spies. For instance, like the CIA code number for Johnny Roselli. Like little things, but they're like another piece in the puzzle that really add a lot more detail about what was going on. And for me, the biggest, it's those documents that really showed the level of the CIA's operation down in Florida, that, as I mentioned about, that Castro had developed informants, and that the CIA documents, and particularly the CIA documents, said, well, wait a minute, why are all these attempts failing to kill Castro? He's being tipped off. Who is it? How is he getting this information? And you see that reflected in those documents. The other thing that I found really fascinating, particularly having done other Kennedy books, was about Robert Kennedy, who has always been a hero of mine, particularly Bobby Kennedy, after the assassination of his brother. He was really, a lot of the modern Democratic Party today has its roots in the 1960 campaign of Robert Kennedy. But before the death of his brother, Bobby was really a different man in many ways. And he was much more hard-driven. He was certainly anti-communist, but he was also somebody who felt particularly in this case, he oversees the attempts by the Cuban exiles and by the CIA down in Florida to overthrow Castro's government. And he's on their back all the time. And there's a lot of documents and a lot of testimony about Bobby Kennedy.
The Attorney General.
The Attorney General essentially being the de facto CIA director, running an undeclared war down in Florida, and basically being on the backs of the CIA agents saying, come on, why aren't we getting any results here? And so it's really interesting to me, as somebody who admires Robert Kennedy, and I do admire Robert Kennedy in a lot of respects, but when you look at that time period, not unlike his experience with working for Senator Joseph McCarthy earlier to this point, where you have to scratch your head. There were really two Bobby Kennedys. It was Bobby Kennedy before his brother's killed, and then Bobby Kennedy after his brother's killed. Very different men.
Yeah, you had started to get to the training down in Florida before we went back to Mayhugh, where you're talking about Roselli was the guy like on the ground there.
Right.
Thank you for watching the video, guys. If you haven't already subscribed, please smash that subscribe button and check out this clip's full podcast episode by clicking here or in the description below.